way.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
but here we go.
Yeah, so thank you so much for taking some time today and for being part of this project. I'm honored to have you participate, and I think your voice is really important in bringing a global perspective to some of the issues that we're struggling with here in the United States.
Sure, yeah, pleasure.
So you start your chapter off by talking about your grandfather, and I didn't realize before reading the chapter that you wrote that he had spent a considerable amount of time in the United States, and that was very formative for you in shaping your views about education.
Yeah, that's true. He actually left Finland in 1914, just a few months before the First World War broke here in Europe for good. You know, his plan was never to come back, and you know, his life situation was particular, and the country, you know, Finland was part of Russia that time, and the situation had got really difficult with the eastern neighbor, and so he didn't see much opportunity in his old homeland. So he left his family. He was 17 years old and took a boat and went through Ellis Island to New York, New Jersey, and said that this is my life.
Yeah, and being from New York, even though I'm in Pennsylvania now, I could totally relate to that, right? The Great American Melting Pot during that time, where immigrants from all over the world were coming together. But you write in that first part about how your grandfather shared with you the educational inspiration in the United States, in America, and how, you know, and then just a paragraph later, you write about how the United States is no longer one of the most interesting places in the world when it comes to education. So how do you see that shift happening in the last century? And, you know, where do you see us going forward?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Really, my grandfather is a long time already passed away, but I remember when I was I was a schoolboy actually, when he was telling about this great education that he received in the U.S. He was an engineer and very kind of a skillful person. And when he returned back to Finland later on, he used all those skills that he called American skills and knowledge to you know, build ships and all kinds of wonderful things. And had a really good life, and he always associated that to the great education and opportunities that he got in the U.S. And I think, you know, for many years the United States really was a kind of a pioneer, for example, in making secondary education accessible and available for all, far before it happened here in Finland, and kind of a faith in education as a means to social mobility and opportunity. And you know, it's a great question. I think your book is actually more about this whole story of, you know, what has happened and what is the situation. I think in a little bit different circumstances, your book would have a completely different title. But now I think that the question really is that if the question is not that what went wrong, but, you know, why do we need to you know, look at the United States and education there through that type of lens that you are doing. I think, you know, probably one reason is that at some point of time, the education simply became too politicized, that it was not anymore kind of a human rights or human development issue, that it was much more a one topic in the political debates and power, using power. And that's not only the United States. There are many other countries where education today is not anymore kind of a giving all the children good education and raising the education nation. Is much more about, you know, who can use power in this political game. And I think that's where the United States has gone wrong. I think, you know, one question I have always when thinking about the books like what you this great book that you have edited and put together is that, does it really have to be that way? That is this kind of the end of the story and we just have to live with this, or can we change the course? And I think what I try to contribute through my chapter is that you know, we have this huge opportunity to change our minds. It's not going to be easy and it's not going to happen quickly, but there's always a chance to think again and look back what you have done, what the America has done, but also look at the, you know, what has happened elsewhere. And some education systems have found a kind of a different way, and that's the whole story.
Well, you know, it's funny you mentioned that, because that is when I was first looking at who I wanted to invite to contribute, and obviously you were near the top of my list, just because I know that you had been involved with past Flip the System books, and we have some mutual friends, and I'm a great admirer of your work. But I really, I wanted to bring in a international perspective to the United States, because sometimes, and you write about this in your chapter, how we're somewhat myopic and we don't see beyond our borders sometimes. But there's cause for optimism, because other education systems that were in disarray for different reasons were able to find their way out by focusing on some of the innovations that came out of the US. And I was talking with Dennis Shirley doing one of these interviews the other day, and he talked about that symbiosis between international education systems and the US, but he talked about it in a very different way, because he was talking about how sometimes some of the mistakes that are being made are coming out of the United States and being shared with other places. And you write about this beautiful optimistic vision of how some of the great things that are happening in education are coming out of the US. And I love that. And so share some of those ideas that are coming out of US education research that are really transforming other systems.
Yeah, I think that Dennis really has a great point in this. And I think, first of all, what makes Finland very distinct compared to most other education systems is that we understood very early on, and this is partly one of those American lessons that we took, that teachers are important. We took this very seriously, unlike most other countries. And in Finland, it meant that all the teachers had to be educated in the research universities up to the advanced further degrees, including the primary and early childhood teachers. And this was our understanding, was that this is not just that we will have better teachers, teachers who are able to teach better mathematics and all those complex things, but that we will have a teaching profession that is able to kind of have a word about what is good, what is working, and what is not, what are the good ideas, and what is nonsense. And this is where the many other countries have gone wrong, that they kind of have a teaching profession that is not able to understand what is going on in the field. So that's why partly in the 1980s and 90s, when all these global ideas of standardization and testing and privatization, all those things started to move around, that Finland already had a teaching profession that is able to say that, hey, wait a minute, where's the research? What do we know about this? And where does it come from? Even if the educators, teachers in Finland were able to communicate in English or international other languages than Finnish. And that's the kind of a critical thing, because when you have a teaching force that is beginning to ask that, okay, so where are the good ideas? What might work here? And what would fit into the kind of education culture that we have? Then you get into this next point of identifying those ideas, and that's where the education system in Finland turned to other countries heavily, and particularly United States. For example, the simple idea of cooperative learning, that is a fundamentally American-based kind of most of the research and most of the pioneers in cooperative learning are still in the United States. And they have been there since the 1970s. And this was a kind of a great idea that the Finnish educators, me included, many years ago, that we realized that this is a great idea, cooperative learning. What could be better than teaching children cooperatively so that they can learn together and help one another and get to the next level of learning. So we were able to kind of look at this evidence through there. Howard Gardner, who's a great friend and one of my heroes in education, who came up with this idea that children have not one or two intelligences, but plenty, multiple ways that you can be smart and good in school in a number of different ways, not just in reading and mathematics. And when the Finnish educators were looking at that in the 1980s, particularly teacher educators and policymakers, they realized, hey, this is the idea. This is exactly what we want to have in the education system. And then we have had a kind of a number of people working in the educational, student assessment issues. And Finland has always been a kind of a careful with the accepting the ideas that we can assess what kids learn or how the system works by employing one standardized test and then use that data to say that, this is good or somebody's failing. We understood that, kids need to be evaluated in a number of different ways. And who else could we turn to but the American researchers? And then finally, you asked for examples. A great example comes from the work of Bruce Joyce and his colleagues about, how teachers improve, how teachers get better in their work. And Bruce and others developed in the 1980s, actually, the idea of peer coaching. That is now, the coaching is now the big issue globally. But the peer coaching in 1980s was a really kind of a revolutionary idea that we are not we are not trying to change teachers by teaching them how to teach, but we are helping teachers to learn from one another and get better by practicing in the classrooms with the kind of a peer coach from their own school somewhere else. And in Finland, I was part of the community in 1980s when we said that this is exactly what we need. This is like a design for the Finnish type of system in the 1980s. And there are a number of other things that it all goes down eventually to the fact that you need to have a teaching profession. You need to have not just the teacher organizations or unions that understand these things, but you have to have a kind of a critical mass of teachers in schools who are able to say that, hey, wait a minute, is this the kind of a right way to go, or could there be something else? And who are able to kind of make sense out of this huge noise of educational ideas and innovation that is going around. And that's where the kind of a secret of the Finland's ability to choose the right way, where we are right now, came from.
As I read your chapter and as we're having this conversation now, I can't help but reflect. I graduated from university in 1997 when I got my teaching degree. And so many of the ideas that you write about were mainstream in my teacher education programs. Cooperative learning, multiple intelligences, peer coaching was one of the metrics that was allowed as teacher evaluation when I first started my career. And then I think about where we are in American education right now and how far we've moved away from those things.
Mike, this is one thing. I spent about 10 years of my life working and living in the United States, and this exactly question has always been in my mind. I just don't understand that people like you and thousands of others who have had a good education, and sometimes you have been taught and supervised by these same heroes of Finland that I was talking about, but you still kind of make kind of a better use of those people like yourself and others to be asked seriously that, Mike, what do you think? Does this make any sense? And I'm sure that today many of these things in the United States, just take the test-based accountability idea, that the whole thing, the mess that came with No Child Left Behind 20 years ago. If somebody had been asking seriously teachers that, do you think that this is a great idea? I think you and others would have probably say that No Child Left Behind definitely is a great idea, but how we do it, it doesn't work.
Right.
And it took billions of dollars, and damage was done to millions of children before people came 15 years later saying, I'm sorry, it didn't work like this. Just by asking teachers, just like Finland did, asking teachers and listen to them and have a conversation, people would have said, okay, that may be a bad idea, let's try something else.
Yeah, and you hit on one of the central points of the book, and I think that's so important that, so often in education, and I'm speaking, primarily about American education because that's the context that we're talking about here. But so many times we make decisions in education, and I say we, talking systemically, and we end up with these horrible unintended consequences because we didn't involve the people who are at the point where policy and practice meet. Right? We never involve teachers in those discussions, and then we suffer because we didn't realize how it would play out when the rubber meets the road. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about. But I want to shift for a second, and I want to dive into cooperative learning, especially, and I want to talk about how have you seen in Australia or in Finland or from others in the United States, how the idea of cooperative learning has played out during the pandemic when we're in this new situation with new models of instruction. I'm just curious if you've seen any research come out of that, or have any anecdotal evidence from teachers of what's working.
No, it's a great question, Mike, and I haven't seen anything coming out. One thing is that, and I say this with the full understanding that I don't have evidence from all the teachers, but my experience, I've been doing research and publishing books in Finland about cooperative learning, and being a board member of the International Association for a number of years, and I do know that it's easy to say cooperative learning, and it's easy to kind of conclude when you look at people working that, okay, there's a cooperative learning going on. But you, Mike, if you know anything about cooperative learning, you know that it's one of the hardest things to do in practice. It's a very complicated thing to make work in a way that David and Roger Johnson or Elizabeth Cohen or Sharon Yael and Shlomo Sharan and others, Bob Slavin in the States have been kind of made it to work. So I think that there are two separate things there. I'm sure that this pandemic, COVID, has increased a kind of a focus on, working together, and particularly when it's absent, when the kids kind of, work together and learn together mathematics or science or English, whatever they do, that people kind of realize that, when it's missing, when it's taken away, the opportunity to cooperate and learn together, it's not a good idea. But I don't think, and I'm saying this simply because there's no evidence, that the pandemic itself, these school closures and social isolation and other things, that it would have increased the cooperative learning. It's much harder thing than that. Cooperative learning doesn't just happen like this. Let's do some cooperative learning. If the teachers haven't done it before, if they have not been trained to do that, it's not going to happen. So that's, I think we can probably see more cooperation and collaboration in different levels of this pandemic happening right now, sometimes through the technology and, Zoom like this, sometimes within the families or communities. But I don't think, cooperative learning is too complicated and complex thing to understand and do, that anything like this would actually significantly kick off something that we could conclude and say that now, another thing has happened.
Yeah.
Basically, if we want to do more cooperative learning, it means that we have to go back to our books and research and practice and really work on it, and then say that, okay, let's do a little bit more of this great idea.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. I think one of the places where that question comes out of, the previous book that I had written along with Yelmer Evers, who I know is a mutual friend, and Armand Doucette, we really focused on the use of educational technology to emphasize humanity and build relationships and keep education grounded in those things that are most important. And just as an educational researcher, I was curious if anyone was really looking at that right now that we're forced into this situation where technology has become more important. If there are intentional models for cooperative learning that are being looked at that are a little bit different than maybe what was done when we were face to face to build those kind of relationships.
Mike, yeah, great thinking. I'm sure that there are some people who are looking at, if not cooperative learning, but then this collaborative learning that is a kind of a sister concept for that, and is often used in a kind of a situations like this, that we kind of collaborate using the technology and media, which is great. But cooperative learning for me is much more. It's a kind of essentially it requires that we are face to face, that I can see your emotions, I can see, where you are and how you kind of react to different things. And it's not absolutely necessary, but that's a kind of a natural environment. But collaboration, collaborative learning and working and studying together, for sure, there are a lot of research going on about that during this time of pandemic.
Yeah. So I think that answer leads me into another question that I wanted to ask, and it's about your most recent book, Let the Children Play, which I know is something that we're both incredibly passionate about. Obviously, you wrote a book about it. But about, there you go, right there.
It's always here on my desk.
So it's just such an important thing for kids to have that freedom to explore and play together. And I think a lot of times that social interaction helps them build skills that are maybe not implicitly focused on in school, but are just as vital as anything that we're teaching. And I know that that's been something that's been difficult worldwide in this situation with COVID. Is there anything that you want to kind of share that where those two things intersect? Because I know you probably didn't write that book with COVID in mind.
No, I didn't. No, it actually came out just before the COVID. But actually, Mike, I would like to add this "Let the Children Play" idea in my list of great American innovations and ideas that were and have been partly ignored in the United States, but adopted and used by many others, like Finland. Finland is really a play nation when it comes to children. And again, much of the inspiration came from and still comes from the research of the pediatricians and educators and psychologists in the United States. But that you're absolutely right that there's nothing better in this time, this very hard, difficult time. Again, when there's so much loneliness and social isolation, and kids cannot go to school to meet their friends, and in many places the children have been locked in their apartments and homes, not to go even outdoors to the park or forest or something like this. So I think this book is a timely thing. In a sense that it's a reminder of these absolutely critically important aspects of health and well-being, primarily and first, and then the education, teaching and learning secondly in children's lives, that deserves to be kind of looked at in more detail and kind of a peacefully and quietly to ask these questions. What is good for our children. And the interesting thing with this particular topic is that whenever we're asking these questions, that what is play and why is it important, what does it do to children, and what happens when the play is taken away, the most convincing evidence again comes from the pediatricians and medical doctors, not educators and early childhood folks, who are carrying an important voice. But this again, the American community of, for example, the AAP, the American Association for American Academy of Pediatricians or Pediatrics, has been extremely powerful, in reminding people, educators and parents, about the importance of children's play. For example, in Finland, we have the similar communities and similar health and children's experts, but their voice is nothing like the AAP in the United States. It's a very, very powerful. Their work has been world-class, kind of a leading work around the world. everybody's making references to this, the power of play that the AAP published a couple of years ago. Yeah. So again, I think the United States is in a we get back to the same situation, that America is in a kind of a optimistic situation, because you have all these people, you have all this research and data, you have this, these experts are communicating these things to the people. If you want to hear them, if you want to listen to this thing, and this voice of importance of children's play is absolutely critical in the times like this.
You wrote in your chapter, and I know that you were referring to teachers in the sentence, but you wrote that time is a critical condition in order for us to be able to flip the system. And I can't help but think that it's that statement is also true for our kids, right? Yes. That they need this free time. But let's get back to teachers for a second and talk about that, because if we're going to create this kind of education system where the teaching profession is elevated, teachers are stepping into these new professional roles, the hierarchy is flattened, and teachers have more autonomy and agency in the system. Obviously, time is critical, and it's also the resource that I think if you talk to almost any American teacher, and this is probably true in other places in the world too, they would tell you it's the resource that is most scarce in schools.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's actually a striking difference between countries. If we look at the kind of a larger international global picture, how differently time is kind of distributed in schools and teachers' lives around the world. Again, in Finland, for example, Finland is one of those countries with some others where teachers have relatively less time scheduled for classroom teaching. That is, of course, the main part of the work of teachers, and significantly more time during the school days to work with with their own work planning, but also to sit down with their colleagues and talk about teaching. And often people, when they visit Finnish schools, I hear them saying that how much more relaxed the atmosphere is. How often they find teachers sitting in the teachers' lounge, having a cup of coffee, and talking about what they do in the classroom. And at the same time, I've been seeing hundreds of schools in the United States, and how kind of a rare this kind of a thing is, that you can go to the teachers' lounge, if there is any. So in many schools you cannot even find a decent place for teachers to sit down. That you would find teachers having a cup of tea or coffee and passionately talking about the teaching and learning. And when you take that kind of an informal element away from teachers' work, you understand this better than most other people, that how much poorer you are as a professional when you have to use the evening times or holidays or weekends to do that. And most people honestly don't want to do that, and it's a right thing to do. So time is a critically important thing. I did my own PhD research many years ago about this same thing, that how teachers perceive time and what happens when the time is not there, but we are still asking teachers to do more or differently. And that's why time for children to play and teachers to we can call it the teacher play in school. I think that's my next book will probably be called let the teachers play in school, because the play is so critically important part of the being able to do things better. And just imagine for a moment a school where the kids would be playing more in the United States outdoors and discovering themselves and one another, and at the same time teachers would play in their staff rooms or in the school to kind of figure out new and different ways of doing what they do. Beautiful world.
One of the chapters towards the end of the book in a different section than yours is on the EdCamp model in the United States and how successful that's been, and that doesn't quite codify it in the way that it is in Finland, where it's built into the school day. But I think there's just this huge demand for teachers to have these informal conversations to explore the things that they want to that they know that they need to learn but don't have time to during the regular school day, to play with new ed tech tools or new pedagogical models, and EdCamp provides that. And I just think, how wonderful would it be if that was part of our job, rather than something that teachers had to take a day, of their precious weekend when they're already struggling with these mental health issues, to give up part of their weekend to go and do this with other professionals. If it was built into
and Mike, the international evidence that is there can be helpful in, when we communicate these things to the parents and politicians and administrations, is that, the evidence is very strong that it doesn't matter if we add hours to teaching and learning. If we ask people to teachers to teach more and kids to sit more in the classroom, it doesn't add anything to the quality of outcomes. Actually, often it goes the other way around. And that's why, because we cannot add any more hours to the teachers' 24-hour day or kids schedule. So we need to ask this question: that what does the international evidence say about teaching more or studying harder when it comes to the outcomes? And the evidence is saying that there's no relationship between how much or how hard you try and work and what you get out of the education as outcomes. So we have to work smarter, not harder. And that's the kind of a thing that some other countries have really realized, that that's the way to better outcomes.
And as much as we focus and as much as the term, data-driven decision-making, floats around in American schools, it's true that we are so myopic in our vision and egocentric in our thinking that we don't often look for evidence outside of the United States, right? We have these, what we perceive to be American values of hard work and grit and determination, which are all fantastic things. But what's being shown to us, if we just look beyond our borders, is that there's a better way of doing things. And I think, as you were talking before, one of the questions that I think most American teachers would have is, okay, so if I had this time freed up to be able to talk with my colleagues, what would the kids be doing? And I think the answer is just so obvious, right? They would have time to go and play and explore and free, right?
Don't worry about that.
It goes together so well, right?
Yeah, just let them play. Yeah.
So,
but Mike, if I can add one more American idea here, and this is this famous Google example some years ago. Remember Google came out with this idea of giving 20% free kind of unstructured time for knowledge workers in the company to just figure out new things and discover new ideas. And many actually many things in the Google company have been invented because of this fact that people had day a week or 20% of their time just to do whatever they want to do. And the Finnish school, I've written somewhere else, the Finnish school has been using this 20%, this Google idea, far before the Google was even established, by making sure that the teachers and kids have a kind of a decent amount of time every day, hour or two, for themselves. And this is where often miracles happen, that when you don't program or plan something, as we do now in American schools, every single minute and second is kind of a program and schedule to do something. Just loose up a little bit and let the people hang around and meet people that they normally wouldn't meet, or take a book from the library shelf and read a magazine that they wouldn't do. I hope that many people will pick up your book and never realize that, I didn't know about this. And then they meet somebody else and go and invent something new. These things don't happen in the school environment or working environment where 100% or close to 100% of the time that you are there is programmed and you are asked to do something or be somewhere. So we have to, and this pandemic is a great moment now to think about it. Why not loosen up a little bit and get closer to this 20% in schools and universities and elsewhere, just to give people time to, come up with the miracles.
Right.
And that's, it's easy. It doesn't cost anything. It's just a kind of a way of, changing the way we think.
So we're almost out of time, but there's definitely one more question that I want to ask you. In the chapter, you give 5 recommendations, and I think you've touched on most of them so far for what the United States can take from other systems and bring back for the most part, because most of these innovations, like you said, started in the United States. So you have teachers leading and learning from each other, using multiple forms of assessment, and assessment at the local level rather than these big time standardized tests, multiple intelligences, cooperative learning you touched on. But I want to get to your first recommendation, which is really that we need our education system to promote healthy democracy and really get back to a more student-centered pedagogical model where kids are able to make mistakes and learn from them and pursue their passions, because those are the things that are going to help them become good citizens and contributing members to democracy outside of school. And I definitely want to give you some time to talk about that, because I think it's so important and so foundational to what we're trying to do with this flip the system model, where we're trying to get education back, and I say back with the acknowledgement that in the United States we've had huge gaps in certain populations not having access to education and not being able to participate in democracy, but really restoring public education is the foundation of a strong democratic society.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that, Mike, this is exactly what your new book celebrates, is this idea that you so nicely, you can phrase it much better ways than I do. But for me, there are different levels in this. That the public education is a cornerstone and foundation of all these things, of having stronger democracy and happier and healthier societies and systems elsewhere. But then underneath that, there's this other important level, and it's the students' voice and their engagement, and of course the teacher agency and teacher autonomy are the other things, and democracy at that level. But the kind of a fundamental thing that will in a way be determining how the future will play out is that how do we understand the students' role and the importance of their voice and democracy at that level. This was a Dewey's idea. Dewey's idea was not to have a democracy only at the level of the system. He was mostly concerned about children as young citizens and how they experience this. And what we see now around the world, here in Australia and Finland, many other places, the children don't find schooling that engaging and meaningful anymore, but they find the importance for their lives and answers to the questions in all kinds of other places, but not in school. So that's why it's critically important to get back to this question, that how do we bring this democracy at the level of the children and they being and presence in the school. And that's why I think we can use it. We can build this with the same values. We can build this kind of a deeper democracy in our school systems. And if you look around the world now, young people and children are taking a leadership in the climate change thing that we adults and governments and politicians have not been able to make the change. So the kids are making the change in climate change. Human rights, Black Lives Matters is another one in the United States and around the world, that young people are driving those things. What is next? The list is long here. And, my feeling is that unless we are able to, quickly realize and kind of rethink education as an integral, important part of the democracy at all levels, the kids will take the leadership. They will go to the streets, and that's going to be the next agenda, is to change schools and education systems so that the education will provide them with something that is helpful and meaningful with all these other problems. Do I want to see that as an educator? I probably would be much prouder of what we have been doing and trying to do if we adults and we who call ourselves educators would understand this more broadly and take a leadership and do this for our children, rather than leave behind the education system that needs to be transformed or changed by kids. That's not their job. Their job is to enjoy what we are able to give them, and education is the best gift that we can give to our children. So we have to act quickly, and I think that your book is making a great contribution to this debate and dialogue and conversation that we need throughout the world.
Well, thank you for that. And that's a wonderful answer. So I think we're going to leave it there. That's great. But again, thank you so much for taking some time today and for being a part of this project. I'm just thrilled to be able to have your voice and your perspective be part of this anthology that we're putting together.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think it's really, I'm honored, not just a kind of a, it's been not just a pleasure, but I'm honored to be part of this very important thing. And I'm going to stand with you and help to disseminate as much as I can to the world. And I wish you all the best with the work. Very important thing. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.